Hello and welcome to another edition of The Debate. Now, as protests against racial injustice continue in the U.S., we hear more about police excessive use of force, even resulting in the death of protesters. Ironically, President Donald Trump claims that deploying federal agents in major cities is aimed at curbing gun violence. In this edition of The Debate, we will explore the different aspects of the protests turned riots and how the U.S. president has confronted the situation and how all this can affect the upcoming presidential elections in the U.S. But before we begin, let's watch a report.
The United States remains the scene of persistent protests against police brutality and racial profiling of black people. Tense situations unfolded in several cities as rallies were held for the 59th consecutive night in Portland. Federal troops recently deployed to the city again resorted to tear gas, pepper spray, and flashbang grenades to disperse Black Lives Matter protesters. It came after a judge denied Oregon government's request to restrict federal agents' actions, including unarmed personnel arresting protesters in unmarked vehicles. A crowd continued to gather outside Portland's courthouse in the early hours of Sunday to denounce the judgment. They vowed to continue the rallies until they get reforms.
The government that we have, they're not really listening to our voices, especially black voices that have been wanting justice ever since the beginning of time. But now we're saying enough is enough. We want change. We want justice.
There's a whole bunch of people that are upset at our country and are trying to peacefully let the feds know that they're not wanted here and that we're not going anywhere at all, at least till they leave, and we'll stay even longer until we get our message across.
Meanwhile, a protester died during a rally in Austin, apparently by police gunshot, and an officer was hospitalized, allegedly after being injured by an explosive in Seattle. Dozens were arrested during the march, which was the largest in the city in weeks. Officers tear-gassed and pepper-sprayed the protesters and declared a riot after they vandalized several buildings. Analysts say the mounting violence shows how increasingly desperate the protesters are to attract attention to the deep-rooted racial injustice in the U.S.
Well, we have an endemic racist problem with racism that goes back centuries, and the only way seems to be to uproot it is to engage in acts of protest, including acts of violence, to get the attention of the authorities and to bring real change.
The protests were set off by the killing of George Floyd, an African-American who was choked to death by a white officer in Minneapolis in May. That also highlighted other cases of fatal police violence. In Colorado and Louisville, Kentucky, demonstrators marched to call attention to two incidents of white officers killing of unarmed black men. 3 protesters were shot and injured in Louisville during a confrontation with a heavily armed far-right militia group. There were also face-offs between opposing groups in Chicago, where brief scuffles broke out between pro- and anti-police demonstrators. The incidents in Louisville and Chicago underline how emerging divides over police brutality and racial injustice are pitting ordinary Americans against each other. That threatens a deeper crisis, especially amid the growing rift between the central administration and local governments over President Donald Trump's planned surge of federal agents into major cities to crack down on the rallies.
Now, to continue the discussion, we're joined by Mr. Matthew Fogg, former Chief Deputy of the US Marshals Service from Washington, D.C., and Melik Abdul, political commentator, also joining us live from Washington, D.C. Let's begin with Mr. Fogg. Now, in Seattle, the city's police declared a riot, and in Austin, authorities say one protester was killed. To what extent will these protests escalate, in your opinion?
Well, I think right now, with the fact that we have the pandemic and we've got a lot of people with time on their hands, people are able to really now look at the history and to look at what's going on now with American law enforcement. It's always been an issue of whether law enforcement was carrying out its procedures in a fair and equitable way towards African Americans. We find out it hasn't been. I found that out in my own experience as a US Marshal for 30-some years in the Marshal, having also won a major law case against justified for racial discrimination. So it is at the very height in theory of our justice system. Now, the problem is now that we got the cameras and people are actually physically seeing these acts of violence against the humans, against the citizens. I think what's happened is people got time to really look at this and say we need to go out and protest and seek change, seek reformation. And we're in a great reformation period in America where with all of the issues that have been presented over the years of our criminal justice system, the death penalty, who gets locked up, the arrest rates for the war on drugs, African Americans being put in prisons. All of this is now coming out, and I think right now we're at a reformation period where people are seeking change and they're demanding it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abdul. How far do you believe this will go?
Well, so I honestly think that this probably will continue for a while. A lot of what we're seeing around the country are things that have been built up over the years. I don't expect it to settle down anytime soon. I think part of the problem, the challenge now is that a lot of what we've seen is that some of this is also in opposition to President Trump. And so when you add Donald Trump into the equation, which is similar to what we saw here in Washington, D.C., where our mayor decided to paint a Black Lives Matter mural on the street leading up to the White House, and she made it specifically about Donald Trump. So I think that there's a lot of things that we need to do on the end of policing, but also in the community as well, and making sure that we do our part so we're not driving this, we're not pushing these narratives about a lot of things that have been systemically a problem here in the United States.
Thank you very much. Back to Mr. Fogg. Now, Mr. Fogg, the presence of federal police and excessive use of force does not seem to be very successful as a strategy. In contrast, there seems to be need for some kind of dialogue. Do you think that the Trump administration will rethink its strategy?
Well, I mean, I think they will if they're put back in office again. I mean, we're getting pretty close to the time of the elections. But the reality is, as a possibility, I think they want to show strength. But let me just say this, and not for against the president. Let me just say this: this behavior in law enforcement is going on for decades. The sign right behind me, "Bigots with Badges," was done in 1997. That's going to be the name of my book. But that was in '97, saying the exact same things that we've got going on today. So we've had many presidents, Democrat and Republicans, to come through that have not address the issue of law enforcement and law enforcement abuse in black communities, and how do we address this issue. And like I said, and even when I was a part of it, I brought it out, say, look, this is called racial profiling, disparate impact, what our procedures, our operation procedures were. Nobody really wanted to listen, and then before I do it, I was having to deal with it internally. So it is something that's been around for a while, and I just don't know if I think this president, if he's really looking at to try to really get a handle on it, like the other presidents never got a handle on it, maybe he will, and maybe he will finally get the message that more force is not what's needed, but it's community policing is what's needed. How do we get police to work with the communities? How do we get jobs for these folks who don't have jobs, these gangs that are building more and more? Force is not going to do it. You won't be able to take over this thing by force.
Now, Mr. Fogg, as you mentioned, this is basically originally an issue of black Americans, African Americans that have been facing this issue. But now we see that in these protests, there are more and more white people taking part, right, also calling for racial justice. That's right.
That's right. And that's a great, it's a great time and a great movement because of the fact, excuse me, because of the fact that all of America is getting it now. It's not just one faction of America, but everybody's getting it now. And I believe because of the pandemic, the fact that more people have time to stop and look at this situation. It's like I used to say, people going to church, they ride by God laying up on their bridge on their way to that brick and mortar. Now people are not going to church, but what they're doing, they're sitting at home and they're seeing this stuff on television, they're seeing the videos, and they're saying, wow, this stuff really is what black folks were saying all along. We're seeing it now, and we need to be involved. We need to participate because we want to see America change, have this reformation where now people can really believe the police are there to help us all, and not a certain fashion of society. When the police stops them, they got to be worried about whether they're going to get killed or abused or something of that nature.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fogg. Now, back to Mr. Abdul. As I told Mr. Fogg, now we see more white people taking part in these protests, and also polls are showing that the majority of Americans disapprove of Donald Trump's response to these protests. And we actually have polls showing that Biden is now much ahead, leading in the polls.
Well, none of this is really surprising to me, and that's why I mentioned earlier that a lot what we're seeing now, and you even made the parallel between Donald Trump and this Black Lives Matter movement, the protest movement. This is something that we've been seeing for a while. The Black Lives Matter movement, the organization itself found its footing after the killing of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman. We saw all of this throughout the 8 years of Barack Obama, and now what's happening is that a lot of this is being internalized to an extent where we're looking at Donald Trump for the answers in ways that we haven't looked at previous presidents. What we saw with the Trump administration sending in federal agents to Chicago and Kansas City, those things are consistent with what the federal government has been doing for quite some time now. In Baltimore, I think it was a couple of years ago, Baltimore's mayor asked for federal agents to come into the city to help with the crisis, the crime crisis, the guns and things like that that they've been dealing with. Same thing happened here in Washington, D.C. So people are using this as an opportunity to push back against Donald Trump. And I think that's something that's ultimately not going to serve the movement itself well, because you're tying it into a particular politician. There are things that many people have problems with, things that Donald Trump has done. But the fact is that this movement, this protest movement, much like the kneeling, as we saw with Colin Kaepernick, the kneeling turned into opposition to Donald Trump. These protests are turning into opposition to Donald Trump. So it's not surprising to me, especially when we have a mainstream media they've been consistent in pushing back against Donald Trump, putting a lot of things that on Donald Trump's doorstep that's really not the fault of the president at all. Barack Obama was president for 8 years, and the situation in Chicago got progressively worse while he was in office. That's not going to necessarily change because Donald Trump is in office, but also protesting Donald Trump as the answer to what's happening. You mentioned about what's happening with our white allies. Well, for me, that's just simply a lot of virtue signaling. I don't need my white allies going to Black Lives Matter Plaza and taking selfies, holding Black Lives Matter signs to make you feel like that you're part of this effort. No, that actually happens in HR offices. That happens in these boardrooms. We need to start getting beyond the symbolism that people are interested in and getting into the meat and potatoes of ensuring that Black Americans have the opportunities just like any other group.
Well, thank you very much. Now back to Mr. Fogg. Do you also agree with Mr. Melik that Trump has turned into a symbol, or do you believe that this is generally hurting the Republicans as a whole?
Well, I don't know. Definitely anybody, Republicans, Independents, doesn't matter. If you believe that force is the way to handle this matter, it's not going to work. Right now, the Reformation movement has started, and you can't stop it. And like I said, because of the pandemic and everything that's given, all the stars have lined up just right. The fact that what happened with George Floyd and seeing him killed in front of all of the world, and the way it happened, I just think right now it is. But like your other guests have said, this is not about just Donald Trump. This is about law enforcement has been this way. As I said, bigots with badges existed in 1997. So, and going way back beyond that. It's just that now we have a platform, people are seeing it more, and I just think it is going to last beyond Donald Trump. I think it'll continue to go. I think when he does some of the stuff that he's doing now, it just fuels the energy. But the reality of it is anybody in America right now has to understand there's a movement here to change law enforcement, to change how we do things, to make certain that it is real, what we call real community policing, have the community more involved in command and control environments, because I know when you got a command and control environment like law enforcement, before you know it, the law enforcement are taking over the same way those officers turned their back on their mayor up in New York City. That when I saw that and the unions saw what they did, I said, that tells you how much control law enforcement has when it shouldn't really be that way. So we have to be concerned of that. Again, yes, when it talks about Republicans or Democrats, when you talk about people in control, oftentimes African Americans have been the victims of police brutality under Republicans and Democrats going all the way back.
Thank you very much. Back to Mr. Melik. How do you think we can detach this whole movement from Donald Trump, who has become a symbol of racism generally, which is probably why everything has been connected to this person, Donald Trump as a person, rather than what he represents as a Republican president?
Unfortunately, this is pretty much what's happened with any Republican. And if we remember, George Bush's, the federal government response to Hurricane Katrina, George Bush, Kanye West, famously said that George Bush didn't care about black people. The late John Lewis made comments about not just John McCain when he was running for president, but also he made very negative comments about Mitt Romney. So the idea that a Republican, it doesn't matter. And I think what we've done now, we've kind of made Donald Trump the poster boy for racism, but that's really not the case, because when it comes to Republicans, typically the perception is that Republicans are racist. So it doesn't matter if it's Donald Trump. We've seen this with George Bush, we've seen this with Mitt Romney, we've seen this with John McCain, and many others. So this doesn't surprise me. The problem is that we have a mainstream media who they're consistent in painting Republicans as racist. There are a lot of things that Donald Trump may do that I don't necessarily agree with, but it doesn't mean that they're absolutely racist. If we look at racist, from my perspective, we have to look at things like policies. And if we're talking about policies, then there's no reason for anyone to think that Donald Trump is president and not, to think that Donald Trump is racist and not also think that Joe Biden, the master of the 94 crime bill, is racist. Not also think that Mike Bloomberg, who said that police officers should go into minority communities because that's where the guns are found, and push black men like me up against the wall if they're looking for something like drugs and money, drugs and guns. That's what Mike Bloomberg said, and we had many, many people around the country supporting Mike Bloomberg. So there are rules for Republicans, and there are different rules when it comes to Democrats and how we view things, this thing called racism. So no, I reject the notion that somehow Donald Trump is this poster boy for racism. No, any Republican is. It doesn't matter who it is. Joe Biden is the person who actually said that if you support Donald Trump, then you ain't black. I don't actually consider that racist, but I do know that white, older men like Joe Biden or any white person, they're not the arbiter of what is considered black. But no one said that Joe Biden was racist for making those type of comments, and similar comments that he even made about Barack Obama being clean and articulate. So if we're going to go down that route of what constitutes racism, then I think we need to have a larger discussion about that and not just limited it conveniently to Republicans and Donald Trump.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Mr. Abdul and Mr. Fogg. We're running out of time, so the final question addressed to both of you is, in short term, how do you think this will affect the upcoming presidential election in November? Let's start with Mr. Fogg.
Well, obviously, structural and systemic racism is a part of America as apple pie. So we understand that is a problem in this country. So I would think right now, any president running right now, people are going to be looking at how do we change policies and procedures in America. So I think right now, but with the pandemic and all the other things, clearly Donald Trump's numbers are down. I mean, that's obvious with the handling of a whole lot of things. I don't think it's just because of the race issues. But we got to say right now, due to this great Reformation period, race is playing a very important role in America, and I'm glad it's coming to the forefront because it should have under many Democratic presidents as well as Republican presidents. So it's good that it's coming to the forefront and people are now addressing the issue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abdul. Your opinion?
So I do believe that this whole discussion will definitely impact the November election. What I'm looking for, and it's many things that Donald Trump has done himself, even starting with January, when he actually formed the Commission on Policing. There are executive orders that he's actually put out to address this. So I think as long as Donald Trump continues to address these issues in an honest way, having discussions with not just friends, not just our allies, but people on the other side as well, I think that Donald Trump can actually bounce back. I don't think that this is cemented in stone that Joe Biden somehow, now with these poll numbers in his favor, this is something that's going to carry us into November, because we remember what happened in November of 2016 when, well, actually before that, when there were so many people, so many polls had Hillary Clinton so far ahead, and then Donald Trump ended up winning the election. I expect there to be that silent majority who will eventually come out, the people who don't feel comfortable being polled, don't feel comfortable being asked whether or not you support Donald Trump. I do believe that those people will ultimately come out in support of Donald Trump and see him into another, for a second term, actually.
Thank you very much, Mr. Matthew Fogg, former Chief Deputy of the US Marshals Service out of Washington, and also Melik Abdul, political commentator, also joining us from Washington. Thanks to both of you gentlemen for your comments, and thanks to all of our viewers for following this edition of The Debate.